All right, welcome back. This is Chapter 7, Part 2, biotechnology topic. And as you probably have already surmised, it's an area that's, of course, actively growing, and it bumps into an area of nanotechnology, too. Nanotechnology is the technology of your generation. It's going to be around for a long, long time. And biotech is not ending either. It kind of merges or adds on that nanotechnology perspective of really small. All right, let's get back to some of the topics that we were chatting about in the previous video. This genetically modified foods is an area of a lot of discussion. We're already starting to see some changes that you may be happy with if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, or if you just want to stop eating some of the meats because a lot of the meats do contain hormones, and it's less flattering for the guys, of course. These types of hormones tend to be more of the type that have negative effects for men, but also in women too. The overall concern of the genetic modified foods, there's already a rather large number of people that consume these products that complain of various symptoms. Now, they can range from serious headaches to much more life-threatening type of symptoms. Now, again, this is controversial. There's a lot of fors and against, but the idea of genetically modifying food that takes it out of the realm of the natural occurrence and into the realm of engineering food leads one to ponder, well, if they're genetically modifying some aspect of this food, what other things could they be adding? And it's just one of those things that you have to make that decision on your own. But there's talks of adding more types of nutrients or resistance to uh, different types of, a vaccine for diseases and things, adding that to food. Or genetically engineering the animals themselves to produce more meat. I remember I used a long time ago was aware of Purdue Farms were looking at uh, chickens that had more breast meat, and they genetically crossed over birds. Now, this is using just standard techniques, and they were able to develop a chicken with a bigger breast meat. The problem was the infrastructure of the bird couldn't handle the additional weight. So the birds become, as they say, down in the legs. In other words, they can't support it, and legs break and they fall down, and they end up bruising the meat and ending up having it condemned at the poultry line where they get ready to process the food. And so I guess you could say that it didn't go so good, but it's all right. The idea was that, trying to get more breast meat genetically done would make the chicken receive more from the customers, because of course it's the prime sort of cut of that particular meat. So anyhow, these things happen, and of course now with CRISPR, and we're talking about last time a little bit about CRISPR. I'm going to go into that a little bit more later on, but CRISPR is where we can enter or add genes from other species if we wanted to, or make some rather significant changes. So that's coming. That is definitely in your generation. It steps all over ethics. It steps into food safety more, and well, chimera type products. I'm going to leave that fun for you, but I'm too old. I'll just stick to my steak and potatoes and be done with it. Anyhow, that's just me. So, concerns about GMO, genetically modified organisms, is what typically that stands for. Organisms that we may want to kill may become invincible. Organisms that we don't want to kill may be killed inadvertently. So, the idea with GMOs is that you selectively add certain characteristics that make it resistant to Roundup and other types of chemicals that can control other creatures. And what you may be doing is, we saw in bacteria, on the veterinary side, just may I digress for a moment, on the veterinary side, uh, they undergo a different set of parameters as far as review for antibiotics. Um, we have, for humans, it's the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration, and their processes for reviewing these new drug uh, uh, when they submit for new drugs to be evaluated, it takes a long time. Where USDA on the veterinary side doesn't take quite as long. So a lot of times you start to see new antibiotics hit the market before the human, for the new antibiotics for animals. And a lot of times these are used for growth promoters. In other words, you just kind of generically uh, give these types of antibiotics to animals, and they spend less time fighting disease and they spend more time growing, and it just means better time at market, and more additional cash, I guess, for maybe an animal that's healthier as a result. Not to say that the antibiotic is getting into the environment and they're starting to see already resistance to that antibiotic before the antibiotic for treating humans that may have an infection with bacteria, let's say, that may already be resistant now to the antibiotic before we can even get the antibiotic into the marketplace. And we've seen that has happened. And so uh, the organisms that we may be treating with GMO may be giving the genes for resistance to some of these insecticides to the very thing that we want to try to eliminate, or what we're targeting. And it's very possible, because these genetics tend to share like that. At least what we've seen in bacteria, it's sort of like um, a bazaar, or an area where people can exchange clothes and things. We have things like that where you can go in and buy used clothes and things, and the bacteria try them on, and if it adds some benefit, they keep them. And so as it would occur in other organisms as well. So it's just a concept I wanted to throw out there, and that's what they're talking about here. Genetically modified crops are not tested or regulated adequately, and there's not a whole lot of things that we know yet. We haven't really opened a bag of worms to see what might be negative things from these types of additions to the food, and start to test for things that we really don't know about yet. So I guess in some ways we're guinea pigs, but that seems to be the standard. Anyhow, the public usually finds out what's good and bad and all that stuff. So genetically modified crops are just one of those that uh, we don't have really a lot of procedures or protocols for recombinant DNA modified things. And partly due, my guess, this is just my comment, it could be that a lot of the legislature, the ones that make the laws, uh, don't know that much about the genetics, and therefore aren't as concerned, because their understanding or knowledge of these things are not as good. Now, granted, it's not just the legislator that it has to be educated. They hire staff or staffers that do that for them. But again, it's also a certain amount of lobby that these companies that sell these products obviously want them in the market, and so they tend to, let's say, grease the wheels with money and reelection and that sort of thing, and that, of course, is troublesome in itself. And a lot of times things get done. Now, we're not naive. It happens, and it happens a lot. I wish it didn't, but it does. But anyhow, those the concerns. The list of GMO of issues for and against are pretty large, and if you do a search on that, I really like to know what you feel, or what your feedback is on this topic, because uh, the uh, the concerns and every time you go to the store, of course, you're making a decision if you're going to consume GMO product or not. And we're starting to see, I guess, Burger King with the meatless hamburger, and there was a lot of fights. Well, can you call it hamburger? It doesn't really have any beef. But it could be eventually we'll have genetically engineered type of tissue that could be used for food. How would you feel about that? That would be genetically modified, perhaps. And you have cells that are designed just to grow to make sort of like raw beef like things, and then genetically engineer that into a food product that has nutrition and other things that you could eat at the tasty Burger King. That's in a nutshell things that could be moving forward pretty fast in the future. Especially the drivers being 10 billion people maybe walking around on the surface of this planet not too long from now. So we're going to have to do something about feeding such a large number. And of course, the more space we take up means less space we can use for growing foods. And so genetic engineering and those things have that potential to solve some of those food characteristics. Uh, so, and this has been a topic for a long time. There was a movie I remember seeing when I was a kid called Soylent Green. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a movie. It's still out there. It seems to be making a comeback. I've seen some discussions about it. I won't spoil it for you. If you get a chance, watch that. It talks about a lot of social issues, and Charlton Heston is in that one, I believe. It's a good movie. It won't be a waste of your time. And then, of course, Gattaca. You need to watch Gattaca if you get a chance. I found an app that I can show a movie now, as if you were in a theater, so that you could sign in and watch the movie I would show. I guess you could say you would have tickets to it. And the idea behind it is I have to be careful legally what I can and can't do, and so I'm looking into this. This is an app it's been established, and they've addressed the law as far as use of that content, because of course the actors and the producers and all that need to be compensated. That is an excellent movie, and it's one that I really want to share with everyone, and we can have a discussion about that. Now that we're building and building these tools that we can discuss these things in biology, I hope you find that these are interesting to you. These are things that you're going to have to deal with. And I know that you're not biologists or non-majors, let's put it that way. Hopefully I can win you to the dark side. But the idea, though, is that everyone has to make decisions about various things, health decisions, food decisions, and things. And it's good to be able to read scientific papers and to make a good, educated decision, non-emotional, a educated one, that you feel like at least you know the facts concerning it for yourself and your family. So that's been my goal. I hope that it's kind of come through as we work together on learning biology. So eating genetically modified food is dangerous. Now, this is some of the comments that are out there. One way or the other, there's a lot of discussions that it's beneficial, it's health, it's risky for health, that sort of thing. Losing genetic diversity among crop plants. There's a project, several projects, I believe, that are storing seeds and things that are untouched, natural, away, just in case we need these things later in the future. And it's important that we keep genetically pure strains, and that was the idea. And anyhow, you may have heard that. Hidden costs may reduce the financial advantages of genetically modified crops, and that's why a lot of countries have turned it down. There's all sorts of things that can happen. Supposedly, the seeds, once they grow into a plant, produce sterile seeds. In other words, they can't spread it. And it turns out that's not totally true. And there have been farmers who have been sued because they had some of the crops in another nearby neighboring farm get into their farm, and then they're sued by Monsanto or someplace because now they're reaping the benefits of maybe crop resistant to herbicides and things like that. And they, of no effort on their own, had seeked or tried to obtain it. But you can see all sorts of hidden potential financial um, issues, disadvantage in this case, or maybe saving money. But a lot of third world countries see it as pretty expensive to grow GMO. So it's a topic that I definitely want you to look into, and I've assigned a sort of a position. I gave you a paper to read. It sort of is an interesting type of paper. I will post how to read a scientific paper. I think it's already in the reference area on Blackboard, but I'll throw it in there just so that you have it in case you want to review that. But I always look at the summary first. What is this piece of work going to tell me? And usually the abstract or something will tell you. And science writing is different than mystery writing and those sorts of things. It tells you who done it right up front. And so, what can I glean from this paper? What are the facts that they found? And then, if it interests you, then you can say, all right, I want to see the research that they did to justify that conclusion, to convince myself that this isn't just sort of erroneous or not. They're kind of bragging a little bit, perhaps exaggerating. So, anyhow, the assignment's there. It's in the assignments area. And I think one of the questions is, are you for or against GMO? And I always like to poll my students on that topic. So it should be an interesting. Just summarize the paper. It should be just to get used to looking at a science paper and then formulating a sort of a prospectus. Now, there's a huge number of references that you can always look up on your own or Google. It's better than just websites that may have an axe to grind or a bent or a bias. You got to be careful. Referee journals are better. I did find a journal, to my surprise, that's owned by Monsanto, which is a big company that sells Roundup and various things. I was shocked to find that on their board, their review board, are their scientists. So I wonder just how unbiased that particular journal. It used to be a standalone journal, and the company bought it. They have enough money to do that, and it's just not something I had considered. That usually I say, well, it was a journal. So a lot of times they have to disclose if they're in conflict or whatever. In the paper they discuss who the authors work for and that sort of thing. So it's a good habit to get into to make sure that the papers that you're reading aren't biased, because you may go around touting it to others, and in reality it's not as truthful as you might have thought it been. So anyhow, just something to be aware of. So, in summary, for 7.5, more and more genetically modified foods are being created through recombinant DNA technologies, and some of these are cutting edge technologies. Don't think that these are older ones. Interference RNA or small nuclear pieces of RNA, all sorts of things are being used to modify foods. We don't know what the health impacts of those newer generations of genetic tools. And then, of course, getting into CRISPR and all those sorts of things. It's going to be something you need to keep reading on if you're interested in your health and that sort of thing. So for the public, numerous legitimate fears remain about the potential catastrophic risk of these foods, given that their development relies on such new technology and long-term financial advantages that they offer. Sometimes the financials, I believe, I don't have to sell this too hard, could outweigh some of the health effects. Now, we see artificial sweeteners that were denied by the FDA, and then when we have presidential changes, when Ronald Reagan came in as president, it was sort of slipped in with the new FDA director that there's some of the artificial sweeteners that were not approved all of a sudden got limited use approval, like aspartame, and then all of a sudden we're starting to see it kind of get more and more and more and more. Now you can't find many diet type things without aspartame in it, um, and those things happen. And so people thinking that just because it has a pretty package and it's been out there that it's safe, you have to educate yourself to make that decision and look at the ingredients and decide. And that's all I'm saying. I'm not selling one way or the other. I'm just looking out as young consumers to think about those things. All right. How do we determine whether GMO are safe? We eat about 193 pounds of genetically modified food each year, uh, and it's probably more than that now. Who identifies GMOs as those organisms in which the genetic material has been altered in a way that does not occur naturally? And that's a pretty wide definition. There is no mandatory review, regulation, or special safety testing of GMOs in the United States. A practical way to evaluate GMO safety is to use lab rats. It's just been around a long, long time. And so, group one, we could feed diet high in insect resistant rice and a diet in non GMO rice and a non rice based diet. So that you sort of have a control, a semi control that you're comparing the same sort of thing, but with non GMO, with the rice with and without. That's pretty good. The results, the mortality rates among the three treatment groups of rats did not differ. No difference in the number of tumors or types, organ damage among treatment groups. Now, I did a pretty detailed search on this. I wanted to find the original papers for this, and I found kind of over the board, over the range of things, that if you leave, it really turns out how long you let the rats live, and so they knew that certain tumors might develop in older rats, so they would just terminate the experiments early. And so those are the sorts of things that I'm leery of, and I just wanted to bring that up. So rats fed three different amounts of modified corn. Some rats were fed modified, treated with pesticide. Others non-modified corn treated with pesticide control. The rats were fed non-modified, untreated, and of course this drew all sorts of criticism. And they found there are some researchers on the other side that would use rats that tend to have a propensity to form a tumor, and a large number of treatment groups but small sample sizes. That's not good. You want a good sample size. 10 rats is not a good sample. 100 rats perhaps would be really much better, and even more than that if you can. Differences between groups were not statistically significant because you don't have a large enough N. You need a large number, and then you can start to see a trend if that happens. Careful follow-up analysis of data showed no evidence that consuming modified corn had any adverse effects on health. Well, again, without seeing the papers and without knowing the details, this is just a conclusion that someone raised from their work. I would offer to do your own research on this. You have the tools, you know how to do it. So it's still difficult to prove something that is not dangerous. Okay, that's an interesting way to put it. Otherwise, it may be hard to prove something that we don't understand thoroughly. That might be a better statement. The issue of the safety of foods containing GMO continues to be debated, and it should be. It should always, especially as the genetic tools change over time. Many organizations like WHO and AMA support the idea that GMO foods are no more risky than non-GMO foods. Now, after the COVID-19 issue, which is still ongoing, boy, I tell you what, the World Health Organization is questionable. It seems to perhaps not be as free thinking as I was led to believe before, and it's worrisome. It becomes political, and politics and science, of course, they mix. There's a long history of that, but it shouldn't. Science is truth, and truth is science. And it shouldn't be dealing with fear and scare tactics and things like that to drive social issues. And I worry about that. And GMO foods couldn't be a higher topic on the list to accomplish some sort of uh, political type goal or something like that. I just want you to think about that. You may or may not agree with me. That's fine. Determining whether genetically modified foods are safe is a complex and difficult challenge. Well, it just takes time. You should never say, well, a number of scientists have signed on and say it's safe. It's a changing target all the time. It should never end the research. So it's ongoing debate. We can, however, ask specific questions about potential dangers and use experimental approaches to collect evidence for or against these sorts of things. The issue of safety of genetically modified foods continue to be debated, and there's growing consensus. Here you go. Growing consensus that GMO carry no more risk. Well, that may be a growing consensus of those who have an agenda. And I'd rather have a growing consensus of those who have no axe to grind. So I look at European papers, in Japan, other countries to see what research and trends they are, not just U.S. Because of course U.S. Scientists are funded by a lot of governmental grants, and if you've been a bad boy and not publishing positive things about something, you may not get grants and various things, and that's something that can kind of mold a consensus. So think about that. It's just out there. I tried to be a little controversial because, well, it is in a lot of ways. Some of the topics can be very true. Treatment of diseases and production of medicines are improved with biotechnology. You can prevent, cure, and treat diseases using biotechnology, and we've seen this. There's a big company, Cetus Corporation, came up with, I think it was Cetus, I believe it was, the insulin. Instead of having porcine or pig insulin, which was slightly different from human insulin, and it was problematic in a lot of folks that needed it, then they genetically engineered the insulin, human insulin, and using biotechnology technique, they were able now to move the human insulin into bacteria and have them produce the insulin in the media, and all you had to do was isolate it and purify it, and then it became a product. And this sort of philosophy has sparked a whole revolution using these sorts of techniques. Other achievements, the human growth hormone, HGH, produced by the pituitary, of course, are finely tuned and regulated and can be healthy when you don't have enough, but it could be harmful if you're using it to try to grow muscles for weightlifting and that sort of thing. And it has been produced by transgenic bacteria, and you can get the human growth hormone as a result of biotechnology. Erythropoietin, this is a protein that what ways that people have gotten the effects of this erythropoietin. It is to work out in really high regions where air is a little bit thinner. In other words, you go way up in the mountains and you work out, and your body compensates for that naturally with this lower amount of oxygen in the environment, and then you go and do your performance or workout or your race or whatever it is at regular, let's say at sea level, where the oxygen is higher than it was in the mountains, and you'll be more efficient. You'll be able to exercise for longer periods of time. In other words, you'd have higher endurance and those sorts of things, higher strength, because you'll be able to utilize more of that oxygen, and that's an advantage. And otherwise, instead of going to the mountains and doing that, you could take erythropoietin and have similar effects. So this has caused scandals with blood doping and that sort of thing, and erythropoietin is also referred to as EPO for those who may have heard that term. It's the sales for EPO is in the billions. It's a big deal. A lot of these are these sorts of things. The problem is that you can get a higher number of red blood cells and the blood becomes thicker, and then you run the risk of higher chances of getting a heart attack, and that's not good. If you've seen, I've been a big fan. I used to, when I was in high school, lift for AAU, and I just did it because I did track and other sports, and I had built up pretty good muscles. It was just one of those things, and so I would compete in the AAU area in weightlifting, and I was always amazed at some of the bulk of some of the people I used to lift with. There was a gentleman that had a speech impediment, uh, and would lift with us in the group that I lifted with, Bob Medlin at State and all that. His name was Lou Ferrigno, and he later became a famous actor doing uh, the Hulk, if you recall. And I didn't know at the time. He's just a really, really nice fella. And boy, his arms were bigger than my legs. This guy was amazing. And he'd work out, warm up with weights, which would be my goal for years down the road, just to be able to lift or bench some of those weights. It's just amazing. But I always wondered, are they using hormones to do this, getting that bulk? Because it just didn't look natural to have that much bulk. I mean, it was incredible. And I would lift with them. I mean, I built some muscles. I didn't use hormones or anything like that. But I mean, I looked like a, a little skinny thing compared to some of these guys who were huge. I mean, huge. And I did a fair amount of workout, and I could lift a fair amount of weight and all that sort of thing, which I'm paying for now. Uh, but we find out later that Arnold Schwarzenegger did use hormones, and he's had I don't know, 4 or 5 heart surgeries and things like that. And I wish he'd come out and say more about the health effects of those, or bad health effects, because he's idle. I was just amazed at weightlifting and that sort of thing. For whatever, you get that endorphin rush, and I love competition and that sort of thing. And anyhow, it's just one of those things that it's out there. So I don't know if you have an interesting story to tell or related, I'd love to hear it and share it. And if you do, please let me know. And I might even open up a discussion board on Blackboard on this topic if that's of interest to you. So biotechnology has had some notable successes in treating diseases, producing medicines more efficiently, and then they can be produced with traditional methods. Uh, Gene therapy. This is something. This has happened at Duke University for many years. I had applied for a postdoc and at Duke, and they were looking at gene therapy at the time, and it was a birthday party for a young lady that was 11 years old that had a genetic defect that at that age it's lethal. Unfortunately, a set of genes is supposed to turn on for a health effect. I won't go into the details, but as a result, it would be tough rowing. The quality of life goes down, and of course, it's not. Uh, Usually, you don't survive it. And using gene therapy, they used viruses to shuttle genes in those days. They were celebrating her 11th birthday because they were successful in transferring some genes over that she absolutely needed. And it was just an exciting area, and I wanted to look at that. And then, but some bad things happened, and people had died because viruses reconstituted themselves, and some of these viruses were cancer-causing types of viruses, and it just gave the whole industry sort of a black eye with the genetic engineering and that sort of thing. So all that's changing now. Uh, there's certain types of diseases like Tay-Sachs, your book talks about, and that's a pretty rough disease, and it's usually just affecting like the thickness of mucus or all sorts of different things we can see that could lead to really significant health issues as you get older. The mucus builds up and you can't breathe and those sorts of things, and all sorts of various issues can occur. Cystic fibrosis, you name it. It it's they're out there. But now with CRISPR and those types of technologies, we can replace the genes. And the risk, which we've seen in laboratory animals, appears to be nominal. Now, they've had some issues and they refine them. That's what they're learning. But I've never seen a potential greater for gene therapy as we see for CRISPR. And I'm really hopeful that that's going to take off in a positive area. So, uh, genetic diseases like cystic fibrosis, sickle cell, Down syndrome may be just diseases that can be handled using newer techniques and even early on detected as before birth could be corrected is the potential, which is amazing. Also, ethically, you have to consider the that too. Also, the genetic potential, like breast cancer and prostate cancer. Guys, if we live long enough, most of us will end up our doom with prostate cancer, and it's just one of those things that probiotics and things can help long term, but it seems like there's certain types of cells that as we get older and our immune system tends to get weaker, the potential for cancer seems to increase. So maybe CRISPR and those sorts of technologies can address those. And it's quite interesting. Stem cells, others research is still continuing. So we have a lot. You have a very exciting time in future in this area. Again, though, it just takes time to weed through all the ethics and things like that. Gene therapy has had poor record of success because a lot of times the viruses that they use to transfer would get recombined with some of the snips and pieces of genetics of viruses that we already have in our system, and then once they recombine, they become fully functional viruses, and like Ralph sarcoma viruses and things like that. And that turned out to be a really huge shock. But our genetics have been around for a long time, of course, and viruses have left little segments of their DNA in us. And so, unfortunately, that was a tough one to unravel to get into. And then understanding how genes work and how they're regulated and expressing genes, we're still just novices at this. So the tools have been developed to try to reduce suffering and that sort of thing. Gene therapy has had a limited success in curing human diseases, but I think that's going to change. I think you're going to see in your lifetime, you know, I already mentioned that, being able to regrow teeth in mice and that sort of stuff, amazing. So the potentials are there. Cloning, as I mentioned before, that there was a company that was there. You could clone your pet and then have a pet that would look somewhere. It wouldn't act. Of course, genetics don't confer all the relationship and the environmental types of things of that. But anyhow, the company didn't make it. But the cloning, it worked. I mean, they could do it. But the idea of what they were after didn't work, and people wouldn't pay for. You might as well just go to the pound and get an animal because they're going to know you about as well as any of the genetic. They may look the same, but that isn't going to be the idea. So the idea is moving or changing, taking an egg cell and modifying it and implanting those, and then you get genetically modified animals. Well, CRISPR is going to change all of this too. This cloning of individuals could be greatly impacted by this CRISPR technology. So it's out there. So cloning of individuals has potential benefits in agriculture and medicine, but of course has the ethical questions in doing these chimeric type of creatures, animals, and things like that. Uh, DNA has been used, as I already mentioned, as a way to identify any DNA that's been left as sort of a fingerprint or a signature based on technologies. And what we do is we use PCR, polymerase chain reactions, to identify regions that we have that are like fingerprints in our genome. They're short tandem repeats, and each of us has a unique number. There's about 15, 16 sites on the chromosome, on various chromosomes that we know about that have these signature number of short tandem repeats, and they are just like fingerprints. And what you can use is a technology called PCR that can locate these particular genes in the length of these numbers of repeats, and then they're unique to each of us, and we can use that to distinguish between one individual and another using these short tandem repeats and using the technologies to do that. And the police have been doing this now for quite a long time and looking at just the sizes of DNA fragments amplified by this polymerase chain reaction to look at these segments to see if one individual is different from another. And so if you have a large number of tandem repeats versus an individual that doesn't, so you weren't at the crime scene, you left your DNA and it's just not yours, you could see that this technology is very powerful, and we use it now for all sorts of things. The PCR technology can be used for what they call DNA barcoding. So if you want to know if that tilapia that you're eating and you're spending good money for contains shark meat, you could use PCR to try to amplify genes associated with sharks in that tilapia. And if they do, in other words, you were able to amplify DNA, that isn't that type of fish, it's from shark. And so therefore you've been duped, and you bought a product, and it happens a lot. Not many people walk around carrying PCR kits or have them at home or something like that. But it's getting cheaper and cheaper all the time. So comparisons of highly variable DNA regions can be used to identify tissue specimens from individuals they use for crime labs, but we're also using a lot of these things to identify DNA from different sources, and you could have an infection. We could use PCR to determine the organism that's infecting you rather quickly, and using these types of techniques. So I hope you enjoyed this. Again, there's an assignment posted on Blackboard to get your feedback on a paper that deals with GMO and to get your overall point of view if you think GMO is good or bad. And I appreciate your time, and we'll be looking into mitosis next time on Chapter 8, and see you then.